Hello everyone, today we are looking at the closed Sicilian pawn structure, which basically is e4, c5, d3, and d6. And this pawn structure is very interesting. It's one which is often a very exciting battle where black goes for a queenside attack and white goes for a kingside all-out assault. And we get this clash of ideas. So it's a very interesting one to study. We're going to look at 3 game examples. We're going to look at the general ideas for both sides. And by the end of this video, you're going to be able to play these positions with a lot more confidence. Now, right before we jump in, I do want to emphasize this is actually the last video in a 7-video masterclass series that I am making all about pawn structures. So we've already looked at 6 other really interesting pawn structures. If you're at all interested in those, I did just want to mention there is a link in the description. If you want to check those out, feel free. There's also PGN files for all of those. But let's get back to the closed Sicilian. So first of all, why is it called the closed Sicilian? Of course, because after e4, the Sicilian defense is c5, the more classical kind of open, typical way to play this is one where white goes for d4 and opens things up. The kind of more closed way to play this is white going for d3. This is often, by the way, met first by playing knight to c3 and then going for d3. And essentially, white goes for a position where their pawn structure is headed towards the king side. And as I previously talked in the last chapter, this suggests that white should continue by playing on the king side. So going for f4, f5, g4, and etc., going for pawn pushes. And similarly, black is going for an attack on the king side because their pawn structure is aimed in that direction. So a6, b5, and expanding on the queen side, trying to kind of open up files and diagonals for their rooks and their bishops on this queen side is usually a very effective way that black plays these positions. I do want to mention one thing. One thing to note, after the move c4, the English opening, one way that black can respond is playing d6, and if white plays here d3, and it doesn't have to come from this exact move order, this is a bit weird, white can often go for d4 here, a bit more aggressive, but in some move orders, what we end up reaching is sort of a reversed position, where again, we have the same essence of one side having kind of a c4 and a d3 pawn, and the other side having a d6 and an e5 pawn. But this time, white is going for the queenside attack with b4, b5, and black is going using f5 and g5 for the kingside attack. So I will be using games that featured both this opening and the more kind of, normal closed Sicilian opening to show you this structure because, again, they are basically the same, just reversed. One is with the white side and the other is with the black side. So ladies and gentlemen, that is basically the ideas. Again, one side goes for a kingside attack, one for the queenside attack. Let's see some game examples to really put this idea into some more real game context. So we have here a Sicilian, eventually white plays d3, we enter the structure of the closed Sicilian. So one of the things to note, white can still have a lot of flexibility in how they develop. We saw g3, bishop g2 here. You could also first, take out your bishop and then go d3. That's common. Or you can just tuck your bishop on e2 and not go for this g3 fianchetto system. So both players still have a lot of flexibility about where they want to put, also you can see this knight not going to f3, going to e2. And very often this is with some specific idea. So here, notice that when black goes for their, inevitable queenside launch, this bishop can become a very strong piece, hitting the rook and the knight, preparing the idea of going e5. And why do they put their knight on e2? Because they want to first go f4, right? They don't want to, develop their knight to the more typical knight f3, because then they cannot go f4. They first have to move the knight. So white developing very strategically here, very strong development for white. Black fianchettoing and castling, very natural. Eventually, we have f4. We have queen d2. We have castles. Queen d2 with the bishop on e3. Often you want to go bishop h6. This is one of the typical ways to make progress with your attack. The game continued here with b4. Black is going relentlessly for this queenside attack. As I mentioned, this is their main point. This is also why they move their rook, so they can be free to move b5, b4 without fearing the bishop along this diagonal. We had knight d1 and bishop h6. We have a trade of a couple of pieces. And you can see here that white continues to go for their attack, and g4 and g5 was the way to bring more energy to the attack. You notice with the trade of the pieces, it might seem like the attack begins to dissipate a little bit, but this is why g4 comes into play, right? g5 hitting the knight, and then you could go f6. You could just bring pieces along the g4 square, and the attack pushes forward. So we have g4, the knight moves, knight to g4 now, sorry, g5, now knight to g4. So here e6 was played from black, trying to slow down the attack. f6 might seem tempting, but after the king moves, it's not as easy as it seems to get the queen in and mate, because eventually black is going to go for h5. And if you take this one, they're not going to eventually take this one back. They're going to use this pawn as a shelter for their king, and in the meantime continue with their attack. So e6 is a smart idea, but now comes the beautiful play from white. So rook comes, centralizes, knight comes to f6, queen comes to f4, and the sacrifice. Knight takes h7, and now black resigned. Everything opens up if they were to take. The queen slides in, and after the king moves, you can continue here by playing f6. This time they don't have the resource of h5, so mate is simply coming. There's not a thing they can do about it. I mean, they're going to have to give away their queen, to be completely honest, and that does not look very playable. So what happened here? Well, white's attack came very quick, and this is the downside of the queenside attack. There's no king here to checkmate. And so if the attack is successfully defended with the black side here, if they defend from this attack, then the progress you made on the queenside, positionally speaking, can be enough to win the game. But if you both attacks are successful, the one that's going to mate the king is going to be a bit more successful. So those are, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. The attack for white is a bit more urgent, and black needs to be able to address it. So now let's back up a little bit and look at a few more games that we can explore. So knight f3, and this is what I was talking about. We're going to look at a c4 and d3 setup from white here. And so if you notice, if we flip boards, this kind of looks like the same thing we just saw from the white side, where the pawns are aimed like this. So f5 is the idea here, going for this kingside attack. And in the meantime, white wants to go for the queenside expansion. So let's take a look at what happens. We indeed have, in a moment, the same idea of going bishop to h3, trading off the pair of bishops. And then f5, right? Black begins their attack. The knight reroutes eventually. We have f4. We have rook takes f3. Everything happened so quickly. And that was very much a product of the fact that white was not very successful. Not only did they not go for their idea of the queenside expansion, but they also didn't really defend over here very strong, right? So the second that we got rid of the slight square bishop that was the key defender, the attack really played itself, right? So with f4 coming, the rook sacrifice, what's the idea? Queen h3, right? Cutting down the king, and now the rook is going to come in, and the king is just getting mated along with the bishop. So bishop to h6, hitting the queen. The knight joins in the attack. There's the threat here, and the entire position collapses very quickly. And in this position, white resigned because they're losing the entire game, right? They're losing some pawns. They're losing the safety of the king. Everything is completely falling down. And so, for example, if the move, random move is made here, then we're going to take with mate. They can try to defend something like this, but of course, this is not going to be sufficient. We can take the bishop, and then we're threatening to retreat back to any one of these squares with checkmate. So a huge attack, and one that white just completely collapsed. I mean, they could not defend from. And again, that came from a very natural attacking idea of going for f5 and f4. So keep this one in mind. If you're playing the closed Sicilian or these structures where the pawn structure suggests a kingside attack, utilizing the f-pawn is very often in your best interest, along with trading the bishops. Let's look at a final game which comes in the same structure that we just saw. We have the closed Sicilian structure in its truest form. And in this time, what we're going to notice is that black's attack becomes very successful. So we're going to look at this from black's point of view. They push a6, preparing at some point to go forward with b5. But first, they open up the center, and this is critical. an attack on the king side or the queen side becomes far less effective when the center is opened up, because the pieces have a lot more fluidity to their movements, right? They can come to the other sides of the board far quicker when the center is opened. On top of that, black can also, pose questions and make threats in the center that would distract the attack. And so even though white tried to create something here, they weren't quick enough, and black very strongly decided to again do these trades in the center that open everything up. So the knight comes in, then we have d4, then we have the rook coming in, and eventually, as I hinted upon earlier, b5 is the way forward, where if they were to take, you open up the rook file, and the entire second rank becomes very weak. And if you don't take, well, for one, you might lose this pawn, but also, opening up the b file is not necessarily in your interest either. So it's a lose-lose situation, and because the bishops were traded already, and because the center is open, this attack is fruitless. And we see this happening right here. The rook infiltrates, we have a trade of pieces, but then you lose the pawn, you lose the other pawn in the center, and once these pawn falls, the d4 pawn is threatening to come to d3. That becomes a very strong threat. And again, the attack is just getting nowhere here for white. So black completely infiltrated. Eventually, they won a full piece. Now, it looks like it might be a bit more dangerous here because there is a threat of mate, but look at what happens. Check, check, and in this position, you'd want to move your knight and take their queen, but then there's mate. That's something to watch out for. So you start with h5, and after they take, then you can take the queen, and this is no longer mate because you have the h7 square. So a nice finish after h5. In fact, white resigned. So a nice attack you can see on the queen side, and that is really all it comes down to. Of course, this was a very general overview, meaning you want to look at the specifics, and depending on the specifics, that will dictate kind of whose attack is stronger. But generally speaking, in these structures, black goes for the queenside attack. You want to open up files here for your pieces and infiltrate along the second rank, and white tries to go for the far more fatal and deadly kingside attack, utilizing your bishops and utilizing the open f file that you're going to kind of blast open through f4, f5, etc. So that's the clash of ideas. It's a very interesting structure, and hopefully this video was a nice way to introduce you and give you some of the ideas that you should know when it comes to this pawn structure. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you are new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.